Hello, and welcome to the Mr. DIY channel. Dang it, not again. No, I'm the Mr. 15mm YouTube channel. Either way, thanks for joining me. Before we get started, there are disclaimers to be had in this video. First, this Neewer battery was sent to me, and it is the battery that we're going to be using for this project. This is the PS099E, and Neewer sent it to me, and I get to keep this for doing these videos. They reached out, I accepted. I did not exchange any monies for this battery. Secondly, we will be playing with wiring up electronics, specifically power bits to a Kodak camera like this one, or this one. As always, take care when working with electronics. Be careful and be mindful of risks. Be ready if things do go sideways. In this particular project, we're doing some very straightforward soldering, and it's really hard to get the configuration wrong, but things can go sideways. Luckily, shameless plug, the Neewer battery has a lot of safety things in it. But that being said, better not to rely on safety features, better to just DIY things correctly in the first place. Full disclosure, when I got my battery, I was playing around with it, getting used to it before I started to think of how I was going to make a video with the battery. And one day, the USB-C port on this decided that it didn't want to do any higher than 2.5 watts for charging. Problematic for a battery with a 99 watt-hour capacity. It's pretty big. Basically, something happened where the port decided that it did not want to negotiate anymore. That's what USB-C ports do to determine what is charging, what is the charge E, and how much juice to charge. This is a problem because I don't have a V-mount battery charger or a D-tap charger, so it left me having to plug it in to a slow USB-A to C connector at 2.5 watts. This takes about 40 hours to charge if it ran dry, which makes testing this a pain. At any rate, I reached out to Neewer, explaining the issue and what I had done to try to figure out if there's anything I could do. And basically, what happened was the support team was pretty quick to respond. They generally got to my emails within 24, 36 hours-ish. And we eventually came to the agreement that they were just going to send me another pack, which they did. I still don't really know why the port died, but they were very good about it. So thanks again overall. This has been a pretty positive experience. Thanks, Neewer. With all of that disclaiming, let's get started. What do you need? Well, this is going to be pretty straightforward. Obviously, for the battery, you need one of these. It's a PS099E Neewer V-mount battery. You don't need to get this one, but for the purposes of this video, that's what I'm using. As long as you get a battery that has a 8-volt output, then you're pretty well good to go. Also, that should be 8-volt, 3 amps. Generally, when these cameras fire, you can expect a kind of chunky spike in current. From what I observed, it kind of only went to like 2.2 amps at 8 volts. So 8 volts at 3 amps gives you a bit of buffer. Now, you also need, specifically for this build, you'll need the Kodak DCS 14n power module. The camera itself does not have a dedicated DC input. It uses one off the side of the dummy battery. That is the power module, and that is this hole right here. So keep that in mind. You do need one of these to do this mod to power the 14n. Next, we need connectors. The 8-volt output on the Neewer, which is shown here, oh boy, that one, is a standard 5.5 by 2.1 millimeter connector. The power module connector is a standard 5.5 by 2.5 millimeter connector. Now, for this video, for what I actually built a cable that is 5.5 by 2.1 on both sides, as you can see here. And that's because I'm using an adapter that I can put on top to make the 5.5 2.1 into a 2.5. Boop! And now it's 2.5. But you can just get the connector that you want to put on there. Assuming you're watching this video because you want to power a 14N, you can buy the 5.5 by 2.5 straight off and be done with it. I'll link to those below. And if you want to order something else to power another thing, by all means. And one of the reasons why I left it like that was because I could then switch this out to attach one of these, which is a 5.5 to 2.1 to 3-pin DIN, which will allow us to also power one of these. Either way, I will link to both options below. They're not affiliate links, by the way. It's just what I found on Amazon and what I bought. Next, you'll obviously need to have a soldering iron, some shrink wrap or electrical tape. And really, that's it. That's all you need to get one of these to work. Get whatever length you want for whatever, however you plan to carry your battery. I made mine very long because I intended initially to have this in the battery pack in my bag while I had the camera in my hand. So a long cable would help with that. But you can go short if you plan to have the battery close to the camera. How to make the connector. Get your soldering irons ready. This is going to be very complicated. You'll want to get your two lines, your 2.1 millimeter and your 2.5 millimeter, or whichever end you end up choosing. Get some shrink wrap, put them around your individual lines, solder the red to red, the black to black, then of course heat shrink that stuff up so that you don't get potential shorts. For extra safety, feel free to do what I did and also electrical tape that whole bundle of poop. I really don't like shorts because fires are bad. Now, you can also, well, I also highly recommend at this point, you do yourself a continuity check. If you got a multimeter, put it on that and check that the center to center are, connected, and the outer barrels are connected as well. This should be a good indicator that things are good. And if you got one where it is inner barrel to outer barrel, you done gone wrong, and figure out what happened. Because you really do want inner barrel to inner barrel, outer barrel to outer barrel. On the plus side, if you did mess that up for some reason, in theory, the battery's power management system will just shut down if it detects a draw of greater than 4.3 amps, which should never happen with the cameras. Yeah, they don't draw that much power. But if you do notice that the port does shut down, check stuff. Double check your work. Something didn't go according to plan. At this point, you can actually test your setup. So let us do that now. I will chunk this into the 8-volt. I will grab my adapter thinger. Again, you don't necessarily need this if you're going to just buy the direct 2.5 mil, but I don't, so here we go. Here's the whole thingy. Here it is, plugged in, and the camera is firing up. Remember, this thing does take a little while, and it is in manual mode. Let's just fire a shot. Oh, look at that, it's alive. And as you can see, oh, maybe not, it's a lot of glare. Oh boy. Let us pull that glorious image, or sure, let's do this. Yes, let's pull up that glorious image. It's a black screen. But we are now running off battery power. You may have also noticed that I have a big old brackety thing. And that is because I wanted to have it on a thing where I could mount the battery. Now, I figured out this after I made my extremely long thingy, so I will probably be tying this up. But in the event I don't want to use this brackety thingy, as I said before, the original idea was to just have this battery in a pocket somewhere or in my bag while I would be able to just hold the camera and operate relatively normally. Relatively. You may have noticed that the V-mount battery is a bit big. And this is good if you're after all-day shooting with the Kodak. With its original pack, it's 7.4 volts at roughly 1800 milliamp hours. And I found out through a little bit of internet sleuthery that it's good for around 400 shots. All right, it wasn't that sleuthy. I found the manual for the 14n and I scrolled down to the battery/power part, and it's at 400. At any rate, with this newer V-mount battery, I did some back-of-the-brain cell math. Just going off watt hours, this should offer up almost 2,900 shots on a charge. That's a lot. Now, let's actually also look at how this performs with the DCS-760. As I said, all you really need is the 3-pin DIN, which I have put somewhere. Excuse me while I go find it. I found it. It was on the ground, right in front of my feet. But as I said, I left my cable a 5.5 by 2.1 because I had an adapter for the 3-pin DIN. So we're going to do this. And now we're going to plug it into my DCS-760. I apologize if this is off camera. It's a bit clunky. I don't have a mount for this one equipped. But here we go. It is on. I'm holding both of these things. They are connected, and date and time incorrect. Awesome. That is true enough, Kodak. Oh, and look at that. It is saving and taking a photo. Let's have a look at that glorious photo, shall we? Wow, that sure is a photo. So yes, using the 8-volt power, this will also be perfectly fine to power the DCS-760 using its integrated actual power port. It's kind of weird that the 760 has one of these integrated where the 14n needs the power module, but that's just how it is, I suppose. One thing that's neat about connecting to the DCS-760 is that the 760's original pack was a 7.2 volt pack at 1700 milliamp hours. This is supposed to get you 300 shots on a brand new nickel metal hydride pack. And again, with my big brain math, this should, on the V-mount power, get you something like 2400 shots. Now, before we move on, I do want to point out something that I really enjoyed about this battery. Some of you may know I'm an engineer, so I like numbers. I like them a lot. So I was delighted when you could see that there's a little display on this pack, and it will tell you how much juice is being sucked down. let's actually give that a go, shall we? So I'm gonna plug in, woo, I dropped some lens caps. Right, I'm gonna plug in the DCS 760. I'm going to turn it on. I probably should have plugged in the battery first, but here we go. All right, I'm gonna plug it into the 8 volt. And you'll see that when the 8 volt is detected, the screen will just come on. Boop, here we go. And you should be able to have a look and see. I believe that's the display. Yes, at idle with the display on, because right now the Kodak is giving me the date time incorrect. It is sucking down 1 amp at around 8 volts. Let us turn that display off, and we are down to a miserly 0.03 amps when the display is off. Or actually, I think it just might be so low, it's going between 0.03 and 0. So yeah, it really, when the camera's screen isn't on, it really doesn't take a huge amount of juice. All right, let us do something like take a photo. Ugh, this is very cumbersome. Okay. Oh, yes. So it did do numbers. Numbers are in beginning, and it's going to stay that way while it writes, and it should putter off when it's done. Oh, all right. It's already done. But very nice. I do really like the data that it shows you. Oh, I should mention that the battery pack, this round circular thing you see, that's not normally on there. I put a little screen protector on there because I noticed when I was playing around with it, I'd kind of chunk it in bags, chunk it in pockets, chunk it in stuff. And I would ding the screen. And I really, really like the numbers, so I polished up the screen and then put a screen protector on it. You might have noticed that there are some light scuffies already on there, but the screen itself is still good. And that's because I basically put a smartwatch screen protector on top of the little LCD to keep it clear. So yeah, whatever this front material is made out of, it's probably just acrylic, so kind of soft, just an FYI. But yeah, if you do get one of these, you too can protect your screen if you're as weird as me. What else can you power with V-mount power? Obviously, since this is a standard V-mount battery, you can do whatever you want with the standard V-mount connector bits. You can connect up monitors, cameras, lights, all the normal things. And because it's got USB-C power delivery, you can also do all sorts of things that require USB-C. Cell phones, laptops, more cameras, all the normal stuff. But I'm not going to go over that. I know this battery can do that. It is, after all, a battery. But what I want to know is that if I'm out with my Kodak and I'm in the Canadian tundra as I am now, I know I'm going to be cold, and that's not great. So what if I want to be not cold? Well, I could wear a winter jacket. But what if I want to be not cold and I'm whiny and I want active heating? Well, I have a heated jacket and it has these little coils inside, but my jacket battery is pretty old and quite poop. So what am I to do? Well, apparently the Neewer also has a 12 volt out right here, and it can support up to also 3 amps. What if I connect my jacket to the battery, then connect my 8 volt to the camera? Can I have my cake and eat it too? Yes, I can. Delicious warm cake. Now, if I were just powering my jacket, based on its current consumption, it normally has a thirst for around 2 amps at 12 volts. Looking at battery percentages, I think that I could keep this on maximum toastage for around 4 hours, which makes sense as the consumption at 12 volts, 2 amps, 24 watt hours on a 99 watt hour battery, little less than 4 hours. It's enough time to take some shots on the Kodak, and also, given that the Kodak's battery drinking capacity isn't that huge, it probably won't impact the amount of heating time huge amount unless I'm constantly snapping non-stop. But at the same time, because you're not limited to just using these 2 ports, I could also do stuff like plug in things to the USB-C port. And as long as I keep the total power consumption under 99 watts, this battery won't complain. But alas, I think if we did all of that, the 8 volts only peaks at around 1.5 to 2, the 24 watts from the jacket, and I want to charge my phone, I think we're only up to some 70-ish watts, because my phone can only do like 25 or 27 watts fast charge. It's a Pixel 8. I don't remember what the number is. It's not the super fastest of charging phones. But either way, you can power a lot of stuff with the V-mount battery. Hello, and what am I doing outside? That's not usually where I shoot, but today it is. So, in today's video, we are obviously talking about the V-mount battery. So, I wanted to show you me actually using it. So, what I've got is my jacket. It's currently plugged in. It is sucking down some juice. See it right there. I don't know if you can actually see it, but I will tell you, it is sucking down 12 volts at just about 2 amps. Oh, let's see. 12 volts at 2 amps, just about. I've also got power going to my Kodak DCS, and you can see, I don't know if you can see, but there is an adapter here. That is the adapter to plug into the jacket on this side, and over here, that's plugged into the Kodak. So right now, the Neewer V-mount battery is powering both my jacket and the Kodak. All right, I'm going to try to put that back in its little hidey pocket, because this is uncomfortable the way it currently is. And I will pull out the Kodak. Here we go. This is the Kodak there. You can see it is wired up and now taking power from the V-mount battery. The wire is going through my left sleeve down to where the battery pack is. Super convenient. I thought it would help with keeping the wire relatively pliable, but you can see there's a chunk of wire sticking out, and yeah, that kind of means that the wire is a bit hard and maneuvering with the camera is a little annoying. But it is getting power. The camera is on. Let's see if I can get a photo with this hand. This is going to be the worst picture ever. Alright, is it on? Ah, I've lost connection. Let's jam this back in. Here we go. We're back. Alright. Can I... Whoa. There we go. So I'm now framed up. Whoa. Okay. There we have it. V-mount power. Powering all my things. Keeping me mostly warm, aside from the fact that I had to unzip to pull the pack out. But so far, so good. I'll continue to take a few photos with the DCS 14n, and yeah, they'll be attached to this video. At any rate, this is pretty funny. I found that trying to use this battery is a fun task. So I might actually turn this into a small series. What can I do with a V-mount battery? What kind of things can I power? Is this too much power for me to be holding for one weird camera dude to have? Maybe. Maybe not. But at any rate, time to answer the question on everyone's mind. Is wearing a V-mount battery comfortable? No, it's not. But to be fair, the original battery that the jacket came with wasn't much more comfortable. So yeah, this will do in a pinch if you have a heated jacket and your battery is pooped. You just got to find the correct lead to power the, or to plug into this battery. And it turns out for me, the correct lead was the same lead that I used to power the Kodak DCS 14n for my jacket, and it ended up being, that's right, 5.5 by 2.5 millimeters. Very, very convenient. At any rate, that's all I got. Let me know what you think of the Neewer PS099E, and thanks again to Neewer for sending me this battery. Legitimately, this is a lot of fun. And I really do actually feel a little bit better knowing that I'm using a fully fleshed out battery pack with real battery management systems to keep me from popping batteries. It's a little bit of peace of mind for my random DIY tomfoolery. At any rate, I will be having fun with this for a little while. Otherwise, feel free to comment down below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.